organizations and panelists. Obviously, we're partnering with two different organizations. So, I'll tell you a little bit about JLF before I pass it to Mariah to tell you a little bit about IfNotNow. JLF, the Jewish Liberation Fund, mobilizes resources to sustain and grow a progressive Jewish movement as a grant maker whose decisions are made by Black and Indigenous Jews, Jews of color, Sephardim, and Mizrahim. One of the pillars of our work is doing education around the role philanthropy can and should have in dismantling unjust systems in the hope of ushering in new practices in the Jewish philanthropic space. And we're really excited to have you all here today as the first step of funding a Jewish future that you believe in. So I'll pass it over to Mariah to tell you a bit more about IfNotNow.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks everyone for being here. This is really exciting. So IfNotNow, for those of you who don't know, is a movement of American Jews. We are organizing the Jewish community to end U.S. support for Israel's system of apartheid and demand equality, justice, and a thriving future for all Palestinians and Israelis. And what we're doing in this speaker series with JLF, as Jordan said, is really interrogating the power structures that exist in the Jewish community, which is something that both IfNotNow and JLF have an interest and a stake in unpacking, and really open up conversations about who controls Jewish communal discourse, so that we can shift the balance of power and enable more progressive Jewish movement building. So we're really excited to be launching this series of conversations. I will be on tech this evening, so if you need anything, you can flag me down in the chat. And I'm going to put a little bit of information in the chat about how to connect more with both of our organizations. There it is. And I'm going to pass it back to Jordan to get us started.
Awesome. So we'll do a quick couple intros for our awesome panelists, both of whom I'm incredibly excited to have here as part of our panel. We're going to start with Anat Shenker-Osorio, host of the Words to Win by podcast and principal of ASO Communications. I just want to quickly say that I'm a massive nerd for your podcast, Anat, so just really shouting out that everyone should go ahead and take a listen to it. Anat Shenker-Osorio examines why certain messages falter while others deliver. She has led research for new messaging on issues ranging from freedom to join together in union to clean energy and from immigrants' rights to reforming criminal justice. Anat's original approach through priming experience, task-based testing, and online dial surveys has led to progressive electoral and policy victories across the globe. Anat delivers her findings packed in snark at venues such as the Congressional Progressive Caucus, Center for Australian Progress, Irish Migrant Center, Open Society Foundation, Ford Foundation, and Lush International. And her writing and research is profiled in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Boston Globe, Salon, The Guardian, and Grist, among others. She is the author of Don't Buy It, The Trouble with Talking Nonsense About the Economy. And Lila, hello, Anat, give us a wave. Everyone say hi really quickly. And we're going to jump into Lila, Professor Lila Corwin Berman's introduction next. She holds the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University, where she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. Her most recent book, which was part of my onboarding here at Jewish Liberation Fund, and which is also super awesome, and I highly recommend everyone check it out, The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution, has been awarded the 2021 Ellis W. Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, and the Saul Wiener Book Prize from the American Historical Jewish Society. Her articles have appeared in several scholarly publications, including the American Historical Review, Journal of American History, and she's written guest columns for the Washington Post, Forward, Chronicle of Philanthropy, and Chronicle of Higher Education. The book she is currently writing is called America's Jewish Question, about the inclusions and exclusions of American liberalism. So we're going to jump right in with Professor Berman. How are you? Your work is really a crucial context for any conversation around Jewish philanthropy. And we're going to learn a little bit more about the relationship between Jewish philanthropy and the state and how that relationship really flourished, not just naturally, but as a means of right-wing activism. So take it away, Professor Berman. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and welcome everyone to this space. It's really cool and exciting to be here. Yeah, so I was sort of asked to do some setup, and so I'm going to offer some reflections on the relationship between Jewish philanthropy and the American state. And Anat, I'm really so excited to be in conversation with you and to hear about you and your work as soon as I do a little bit of this setup. So I was thinking about this program actually over the weekend as I participated in my family's Passover Seders. And until COVID, with just 2 exceptions, I've spent every single Passover of my life in Springfield, Massachusetts, around the table with the same cast of characters, the same Haggadot, the same Seder plate. And these Seders make time feel like an accordion in a sense, as I become the 8-year-old I once was, even as my kids are now teenagers. At the same time, each year we gather, we can't shrug off history. So whether it's like the new babies around the table or the people who no longer sit among us, or whether it's the pandemic that made it impossible for us to gather. And what struck me this year, maybe because we were returning to a Seder of Seders past, but there was also no return, is that Jewish philanthropy occupies a similar kind of space between history and memory. And indeed, when I started my research on Jewish philanthropy, some of the first responses I heard indicated that there was no historical question to be asked. Jews have always participated in tzedakah. Wherever they've lived, they've taken care of their communal needs, I was told, and this was imagined as core to a timeless narrative of the Jewish people, almost as core as the story of the Exodus. And it often found expression through the idea of Jewish values. So what I realized, the more I heard people sort of say, maybe there's no story to be told here, is that implicit in the act of asking a historical question is a kind of affront to memory, and especially to the memories that imbue our collective narratives with a sense of timeless truth. And this was really Yosef Yerushalmi's insight in a very famous book he wrote in 1982 called Zachor, to remember, right, liskor, to remember, after all, is a biblical commandment. It's repeated 169 times, he tells us. To tell history is not. And as I immersed myself in trying to understand the history of American Jewish philanthropy, I often found myself at that like jagged edge between a story of timelessness, a memory story, and the empirical arrangements of historical power and change over time, a historical story. So in my work, my primary argument is that American Jewish philanthropy over the course of the 20th century came to serve as a governing instrument that both reflected the American state and transformed it. And thus, I've argued, it's impossible to understand American Jewish philanthropy in any sense as timeless, but really one has to think about laws and policies of the American state. And in order to differentiate between the historically grounded shape of American Jewish philanthropy and the memory-based emanations of it that often appear in celebratory books about Jewish philanthropy or in the statements that Jewish philanthropic leaders make, I use the term the American Jewish philanthropic complex. And I define the complex as emerging really at the intersection of the American state, right? The laws and policies and agencies and officials, all of these things that regulated the public good and protect private freedoms. The complex is at the intersection of that, the American state, and Jewish communal aspirations in the United States. And by using the language of a complex, something that stitches several parts together into one formation, my goal is to highlight the process of historical construction, of creating something new that was not timeless or inevitable. And I've plotted the rise of the complex from the late 19th through the late 20th century. Layered within the American Jewish philanthropic complex are fundamental changes of American statecraft, right? First, resulting in the massive expansion of the American state through progressive era ideas of state management, and then New Deal programs that built a social welfare state, and then through a turn in the post-war period to transform the state from a direct social welfare model to an indirect one, whereby public dollars and governmental power was parceled out to private entities that were deregulated and freed to operate on behalf of the public. And I contend that without this shifting structure of American state power, right, from very synoptically, a large New Deal era state that provisioned for social welfare to a shrunken state of the kind of neoliberal order, that if we don't understand the kind of shifting structure of American state power, Jewish philanthropy wouldn't be what it is, right? We have to understand the American state to understand Jewish philanthropy. And by the final decades of the 20th century and the beginning of our own century, it's impossible to disentangle Jewish philanthropy from the American state. So let me give one quick example and then tell you a few ways that I think the kind of complex of American Jewish philanthropy operates. So in the 1910s and 20s, when the most ubiquitous model of Jewish philanthropy was becoming that of federated giving, a core rule of newly emerging Jewish federations was to limit capital held in reserve, what we might call endowments. Jewish federations, which developed in most major American cities and functioned as umbrella charitable structures, tended to operate at the time through a kind of revolving door model. Money was given and then it was allocated quickly. Why was this the case? Well, first, there were material needs of Jewish communities, which were constantly at that time absorbing new immigrants. And these were profound material needs that needed capital resources quickly. Second, at the time that these federations were growing, there was not yet an infrastructure of state-based programs to apportion for people who had needs. And finally, third, there were very few advantages to holding back charitable capital or giving massive gifts in one lump sum that couldn't be spent relatively quickly. So as a result, many federations wrote into their bylaws rules against endowment, right? Rules to circulate capital quickly. But after World War II, those rules began to shift. And that was reflecting Jews' socioeconomic rise, the limited flow of new immigrants, the rise of state-based social welfare programs, and very importantly, a newly constructed tax system that offered reward for capital growth. So by the 70s and 80s, federations slowly began to grow their endowments in ways that made kind of the old timers uncomfortable because it really demanded a whole culture change. Why would money that could solve problems or help the community be held back? Well, the answer started to make a great deal of sense when federation leaders, who were more and more people with legal backgrounds and fewer people with social work backgrounds, could explain that there was financial incentive to holding money in reserve, and that more donors would be convinced to give more if they knew that the money would exist in perpetuity. And tied to this shift toward endowment-based philanthropy, which was reflected not only in federations, but also in the massive growth of Jewish private family foundations, was a psychological desire, I would say, to use philanthropy as a tool to deal with trauma. And this was also historically situated. In the post-Holocaust era, the allure of perpetuity, the idea that funds would exist forever as a kind of guarantor of the Jewish future, was really almost irresistible. The language of Jewish survival and continuity gained a kind of particular force in these years, and the idea that money could hedge against risk offered American Jews a path forward. And here's where I would say memory returns, because in these same post-World War II years, when all of these changes to American state policy and finance were occurring, all of these changes were making it such that the idea of Jewish philanthropy as timeless and as an authentic expression of Jewishness was gaining a new kind of currency. American Jewish leaders were more self-consciously than before talking about philanthropy itself as an identity act. They were using the novel discourse of identity and invoking ideas of charitable giving as not only providing for material sustenance of a community, but also serving as spiritual sustenance for the givers. And it's not that this was fabricated or made up, but the attachment of traditional texts or ideas to the modern technologies of American Jewish philanthropy, which were shifting more and more to accumulation-based system. The attachment of those kinds of ideas served to infuse an artifact of a very particular moment in time with the sense of timelessness and authenticity of memory. And this particular dynamic that fused newly transformed rules of American state policy with a kind of thick language of tradition made it appear as if the current manifestations of Jewish philanthropy were themselves inevitable and timeless, beyond change or reform. And this in turn fueled the complex, replicating its logic, turning it into just a fact and not a constructed system that had changed and could be changed. So let me end with 4 ways, brief, that I think the American Jewish philanthropic complex is a conservative creature, in that it can only exist by conserving the sense that finance and power must operate according to its rules. And the rules include, and these are the four things. First, the belief in finance as a tool for perpetuity, right? And there's a very strong psychological element to that. Second, the certainty that state benefits to philanthropy, such as tax deductions and exemptions, are deserved and are necessary and must be defended to the furthest possible extent in the name of the public good. And even when those same benefits might compromise the good of public institutions. Third, the conviction that individuals should have deciding power over their money, even once they've designated their money to operate for the public good. And fourth, resistance to regulatory measures that would increase accountability or transparency of philanthropic disbursements and behavior. So I was going to tie it all back to Passover, but let me just stop there, and maybe later I'll tie it all back with a neat bow. But that's some of the framework, I think, for thinking about the state and thinking about the kind of conserving arrangements of this complex.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Professor Berman. Really appreciate that. And really quickly, I'm going to say for everyone, before we jump into Q&A with our panelists, like an open panel, if you have any questions, please send them to Mariah, who has tech next to her name in the chat. And a selection of them will be given to our panelists at the end of our planned Q&A. But again, thanks so much, Professor Berman. One of the things that I really love about like the composition of our panel today is, a lot of your work kind of deals with that history of how does philanthropy, how was philanthropy built as a right-wing, sort of like a right-wing apparatus. And Anat, the first time I heard you in the Volts podcast, was on your appearance in the Volts podcast. I've been working for JLF for maybe like a month or 2 months, so like beginning in the philanthropic space. And I'd say I was kind of a pretty standard type of progressive who's like, why can't the left get our act together messaging wise? I had like a girlfriend fall to like right wing stuff and like lost that. And so I was going through this whole like existential crisis over like, how do you reach people on the left? And I'd come to the same conclusions about like, big tent party, it's hard, all this stuff, but I'd never actually thought about the role that philanthropy plays in maintaining and reinforcing the status quo. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit for everyone here about how right-wing philanthropic practice has actually enabled right-wing movements to be so much more cohesive and effective in their movement building.
Sure, I'm happy to. But let me first just say that I'm honored to be with you. I feel like I'm definitely, the odd person out here. Professor Berman is the expert, and this is not a topic that I normally, I do touch it because I bitch and moan about it on podcasts, but it's not my core area of expertise. So it's fun to wander into someone else's area. But now I will answer your question. I also would just say that my summary statement on that incredible and super potent analysis and from Professor Berman is motivated cognition is a hell of a drug. That's what we say in my field. And people's ability to make true what they need to be true is really extraordinary and something that you can see in empirical testing. Human beings are incredibly adept at just making facts fit inside of the narrative that they require. But to your question, in general, and I'm speaking in broad strokes, the way that right-wing philanthropy operates, and this is really, really different to left-wing philanthropy. And by left-wing, I should clarify that I mean philanthropy that is dedicated toward advocacy. And so whether that is in the C3 space and the confines of not electioneering and not being explicitly partisan, but still about registering people to vote, or about motivating civic engagement, or even about pressing issues within the confines of that C3 status, which I'm happy to unpack more, or the kind of philanthropy that goes beyond that and is expressly political, whether it's C4 or it's direct giving through super PACs. One of the major things that differentiate giving, I'll say broadly on the left and the right, is that the large foundations on the right and the large individual givers on the right, they tend to give with a bit of carte blanche. It's a little bit ironic. They give with a lot of autonomy, agency to the recipients, with a high degree of trust in those recipients. And what that means from a messaging perspective, which of course, if you're a carpenter, everything's a hammer, so that's the way I'm going to look at it, is that for left-wing organizations, in order to continue to exist, in order to continue to receive money, which if you're an executive director, it is a responsible thing to want to have the check clear when you give people a paycheck. That is not irresponsible, that is understandable. And so please don't mistake me, I'm not impugning any organization. That's what you should do, right? If you're going to pay people, you kind of hope there's money in the bank. That's pretty smart being an ED.
I certainly hope my checks keep clearing.
Exactly. So, yeah, you work in the nonprofit space, you want the checks to keep clearing. And so on the left, every organization is incentivized to have a unique brand. So that means that by definition, the Sierra Club or NRDC or World Wildlife Fund, if we're taking the environmental space, or NARAL, Planned Parenthood, NOW, National Women's Law Center. And to be clear, I don't mean any one of these sectors. I mean all of these sectors. I'm just using these as examples. They're all incentivized to have a unique brand, a unique look, and a unique set of messaging. Because at the end of the day, they have to show back to their donors, look, we did this thing. This was how we argued about the minimum wage. This is how we argued about climate change, which is directly against what actually works in messaging. In order for messaging to be effective, you have to break a signal through the noise. And what that means is, number one, you have to have repetition. Messages that are more familiar to people create what we call cognitive ease. When you hear something and it causes less work for your brain because you can guess at the ending, you hear dun, 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 and your brain goes dun, dun, you rate that experience to be more pleasurable because it is less effort. It is more system one and less system two, for those of you who are familiar with those frameworks. And so repetition is really the name of the game in messaging, right? We know that when everyone is wearing the little red hats that say "Make America Great Again," that creates a form of social proof that says to some elements of the population, this is what a person like you believes. This is what a person like you thinks, pardon. So if you think about that and you think, oh, every organization, in order to survive, needs to have a different message every time, a different set of talking points, a different logo, a different look. You can see why we have had in this country such a challenge on the left having that echo chamber, because we are financed not to. Whereas on the right, they are given money and they are given incentives to echo each other's message. They don't get penalized for that. So just foundationally, it's an incredibly difficult structure in which to make political change.
One of the things that, because I kind of love that focus on the repetition and like talking about the messages that actually cut through noise. And I'll say that it's interesting just thinking about what Professor Berman had just said too in that context as well, about like the way that they've connected Judaism to philanthropy. Like that's a really incredibly potent way of having a right-wing message that really makes us all think that philanthropy is this like impossibly good thing. But one thing that I find so compelling about your work is, again, finding out what kind of message can endure being imparted by those kinds of things, right? Like it's not just not just is Medicare for all popular, does it poll well independently, but what polls well when someone spends 10 hours a day watching Fox News, listening to talk radio on their way to work, and talking to all of their coworkers who are complaining about liberal elites and Biden, et cetera. So what kind of message is actually able to cut through that right-wing noise?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard to answer just like for all messages ever, but I'll lift up a couple of things. Number one, it has to begin, the message has to begin by seizing the moral high ground. So a lot of what works and doesn't isn't so much about the wording, it's actually about the ordering. And we find in testing over and over and over again that the same set of 3 sentences shuffled around do far less well. So the order of a message that actually works, I have a simple way of remembering it. It's values, villain, vision. Unfortunately, most left-wing messaging, not just in the United States, but globally, tends to begin in what I would consider to be the wrong order. It tends to begin in what I like to call, boy, have I got a problem for you, or this is the Titanic, would you like to buy a ticket? That is our favorite opening salvo. And it turns out that people got 99 problems and they don't want yours, because most apolitical people or only marginally political people are not out shopping for new things to be upset about. They are all set with the current things that they are struggling with. And so the message that does work begins first and foremost with a shared value. So on minimum wage, that could sound like no matter what we look like or where we come from, most of us believe that people who work for a living ought to earn a living. On a message around abortion, reproductive rights more broadly, it could sound like whether we're young or old, Black or white, Native or newcomer, most of us believe that we should decide for ourselves whether and when to grow our families. So shared value, everyone's sort of nodding along. Yeah, that sounds about right. And then second, we introduce that villain. And this is where we really contend with what you were lifting up, the right-wing relentless narrative, which I would be remiss not to point out is a narrative that Jews should understand incredibly well, because here there is nothing new under the sun. What right-wing nationalism has always done and continues until this day is find a scapegoat in order to have an origin story so that the population that they are addressing can feel, hey, do you feel hard up? Hey, do you feel like things are not getting better? Hey, do you feel like you can't leave things better off for your own children, or you're struggling to make ends meet, or you're not sure you're going to be able to, take a vacation or retire in dignity or send your kids to college? Why is that? The only way to get the many to not join together and stand up and fight against the money is to turn us against each other. And so throughout history, there has always been a scapegoat, right? And again, this is a story that we know well. And in fact, we can link it back, as Professor Berman has done, to Passover. What does it mean at the beginning of the Passover story when the Pharaoh forgets about Joseph and forgets about his close connection with the Jewish people and suddenly becomes afraid because, quote, the Jews have grown too numerous? And what does that mean for us today when we have this unrelenting xenophobia? Because people fear being replaced. They fear that white people are growing into the minority. In my state, in California, people of color are already the majority. It's the same thing. There's nothing new under the sun. And so what the second sentence needs to do, I think you thought I forgot, but it didn't, is it needs to call out what the other side is doing and essentially what we call narrate the dog whistle. So, but today, a handful of corporations, or but today, a few billionaires and the politicians they bankroll try to divide us from each other. Or shame and blame XYZ folks. And XYZ folks could be Black Americans, transgender Americans, could be women, could be new immigrants. Take your pick, because they like to switch it up and keep finding a new group to target. So they shame and blame XYZ group in order to turn us against each other. So we'll look the other way while they rewrite the rules so none of our families can make ends meet, right? So that's sort of the crux of the middle sentence, which can be rendered in many ways. And then the third sentence is a return back to the positive. So this is a positive, negative, positive ordering. values, then vision. By joining together across race, place, and faith, we can make this a place where we can all care for our families. So that kind of an ending.
Awesome. I love that. And I want to say, once I listened to your podcast, I started talking about Michael Steinhardt, founder of Birthright, a lot more when I was talking to potential funders in terms of creating a villain, in terms of a guy who recently was found using like black market artifacts from Israel and Palestine to hide all of his money. But just listening to you talk, and you talk about the values, I think I almost like get angry thinking about the way that the right has co-opted Jewish values in talking about it, like bringing us to a place where we're able to hear like Jewish equals this like right-wing philanthropic narrative. And I think that's one of the things that so many organizations like IfNotNow, like JLF, and really like a lot of our partners in this left Jewish space are trying to re-co-opt. So I'm going to throw it back to Professor Berman here. Because this is often a place that's really difficult to sort of navigate, because speaking of things that the right has really co-opted, anti-Semitism and narratives around calling anyone anti-Semitic who doesn't unilaterally support Israel and literally everything that it does, for example. But the anti-Semitism thing is something that's really difficult to discuss in the Jewish space. Or the philanthropy thing is difficult because of that anti-Semitism conversation, because we are talking about Jews, and we're talking about money, and we're talking about a lot of money. So sort of what is at stake for our communities, Professor Berman, if we can't reshape this conversation and can't sort of speak more openly about the clutches of Jewish philanthropy in our community? Your book was really one of the first things that I felt like I had been familiar with that brought this to the surface.
Yeah, it's an important question, and I'll be very honest that it's one I really struggled with. When I was doing this work at various points, when I put out a piece of public writing, I would get the response that what I was doing was anti-Semitic, and like a good message, when you hear it enough, you start to get really concerned. I was not concerned that I was anti-Semitic, but I started to think, oh my goodness, like, is this critique right, that I'm going to somehow give fuel to this kind of movement? But I think I would say a couple things. I mean, first of all, I'm a historian who has studied Jewish history, and you don't even have to be a historian to realize that anti-Semitism can shapeshift in all sorts of ways, right? So the fact that a conversation we might be having has at one time been used to further some particular anti-Semitic fantasy says something much more about the malleability of anti-Semitic fantasies than the fact that we should somehow stay away from that subject matter. So in fact, I started to feel like to allow this kind of, our fantasy, my fantasy of what the anti-Semite might say to control my intellectual inquiry would itself be conceding to a certain level of anti-Semitism in a way that's like incredibly unhealthy. But it's the case that throughout, kind of the development of modern Jewish history, there's been a real reluctance to sort of delve into economic history. And I think that part of it is for lack of good kinds of theoretical frameworks for actually talking about the relationships of Jews and finance and Jews and money. And I think we're living in a very particular moment now when, so many of these Russian oligarchs who had ties to Putin are Jewish people, and they were in part burnishing their images and parking their money in Jewish philanthropic spaces. And if we can't talk about that, right? And if we can't talk about, well, what responsibility do Jewish organizations have to think about where money is coming from, and to think about what kinds of autocratic and really harmful to humanity impulses might that money itself have been fueling? It seems that we just probably should get out of the whole game, right? And so, in a sense, I think it seems to me more important than anything, actually, to be able to have these conversations, right? And to recognize that some of the different structures that American Jewish philanthropy operates in now have nothing to do with what we, might sort of in a Passover moment claim to be the the timeless emanations of Jewish memory or Jewish tradition. That's why it's so important for me to be able to do the work to instruct, whoever wants to read the book or whatever, that like there are these American state structures that have really delimited the way that this system works. And it's not something timeless about Jews, right? And in fact, part of the proof of that is that American philanthropy writ large operates according to so many of these different rules. And so we then, I think, kind of liberate ourselves from feeling like you can't have this conversation or, it's airing dirty laundry somehow, and instead are able to really think about, what are the structures we're operating in, and how might we want to resist those structures, and then maybe even re-import, this is back to the positive, right? Bring back some of the vision and the values of what we as other communities of Jews, maybe than those communities that have traditionally been making some of the decisions about money and about philanthropy. What other language of values and of vision for justice might we want to actually be part of the conversation that hasn't been part of it?
Can I jump
in? Anat, you want to jump in? Yep.
Yeah. Plus a lot to what she just said. When I think about philanthropy, to me, in every form, shape, whether it's personal giving, whether it's foundations, whether it's the kinds of individual donors that those of us who work in sort of hard side politics have to deal with. For me, philanthropy is about one thing, and it's about the redistribution of power. Money is symbolic of the ability to convey your worldview and the things that you think should happen in the world. And so if philanthropy is fundamentally about the redistribution of power, which is what I think, then things like demanding constant reporting, right? That you have to say how every one of these dollars was spent. And there are these stipulations around not using this much on overhead or not doing this or not doing that. Or how was your money, how did you do this? Were you successful? What were your impact measures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that makes as much sense as if I were to give you a sweater for your birthday, and every time I see you, I were to say, why aren't you wearing that sweater? That sweater would look so amazing on you right now. And no offense, but the shirt that you've chosen, really not that cute, doesn't match with those pants. My sweater, however, would be exceptional. When you give money away, it is not yours anymore. And if you are constantly asking people questions about what they did with it, you actually did not give it away. You want to continue to exercise power over that money, which means that you're still retaining the core value of that money. And so when things happen, like, I no longer remember how many years ago, 15 years ago, time for me, pre-pandemic, what I like to call BC, before COVID. I don't know anymore what occurred when. But when Warren Buffett famously gave that giant gift to Bill Gates and said, here's this giant chunk of money, and you can also give away my money with your money. I thought that was one of the most fundamentally depressing things that could have occurred in because as far as power and voice and outsized influence in terms of determining how should global problems, and in particular because of their area of interest and focus, how should problems in domestic education and global health be resolved, I would argue that the Gates Foundation already had more than an outsized footprint in terms of saying, this is our theory of change, this is how we think it should be done. And so to give more power and to say, we're going to put more eggs into that theory of change basket, to me, that's really not what philanthropy is about. And so when I think about these charges of anti-Semitism, I think what Professor Berman said is absolutely spot on. I think that, the cardinal rule of messaging, at least for me, is say what you're for, say what you're for, say what you're for. And if you believe that you are giving money away in order to be at the highest rung, a la Maimonides, of either making people self-sufficient or giving anonymously, which is, next best, then you're trying to actually take the outsized power, the outsized agency, the outsized control that you have and confer it upon people to whom it has been deliberately denied.
So kind of, to take you all's, there's been a lot of wisdom you've given us today. And before we get into the questions from the audience, I want to just ask the two of you, how can those of us who are here today, whether, we have family foundations or $5 a month that we give to whatever philanthropic cause that we care about, how can we use what we've learned today in our own personal philanthropy to make our own giving more effective?
I'll say a couple ideas. I think that one of the patterns that is so present in terms of kind of the imprint of American state policy, and especially the contraction of state social welfare and the deregulation of finance, is, just how many different resources that are earmarked for the public good end up not even circulating to any public, right? And there's so many different ways that we see this happening. So many different tax abatements that cities have given out in the last 40 years for development, with the idea that, a high-rise luxury condo in Midtown Manhattan would somehow trickle down to help, the rest of the people, and therefore it deserves a tax abatement or whatever else. And so, there's this sort of problem when you have a system that itself is predicated on the public good as the threshold for what constitutes philanthropy, and yet so much of the kind of money that is so specified as being the public good isn't even circulating. So the very, very first thing I would say is resist the idea of perpetuity. Julius Rosenwald, who had all sorts of interesting characteristics and certain kinds of, I would say, flaws or shortcomings with his vision, one thing that he was really certain of when he wrote about his philanthropy and was creating the Rosenwald Foundation is it's an act of hubris to assume that we should hold on to the future with our money. And if there are problems today, and those problems are in some measure a result of poorly distributed power and economic resources, and then we're saying we're going to somehow solve those by holding on to money and putting it in this kind of fund that's just going to dribble out a little bit that we use and is going to exist in perpetuity. I don't think actually our philanthropy is doing anything to redistribute power or to shift the systems that are causing all sorts of problems of injustice. So whether you're giving a lot or you're giving a little, think about making sure your money is doing something, which means not parking it in a donor advised fund and not giving it to something that's just going to kind of put it away, but really thinking about how you can use your money and your gift to address a problem that's happening now, right? Something that your resources can actually make a difference to solve, or can be part of a bunch of other resources to not just kind of hold back in perpetuity. So that to me is a really kind of fundamental piece of how to think about disrupting the way that philanthropy works.
Awesome, thanks so much. Anat, do you wanna jump in? We have audience questions to get to, and so we are a little bit 10 or so minutes left. We run over. Do you mind if we hop in, or do you want to jump in now on that?
It's fine to go to audience questions. I think she did a great job. It's a really hard question. I'll just say one thing. I don't know what perpetuity means when we're talking about climate change. So I'll just out myself as a person who actually believes in climate change, just full reporting to you. I think that it's actually happening. I live in California, which is frequently on fire. And so perpetuity to me, I mean, this is a speech that I have made multiple times at OSF, at Ford. I'm like, what are y'all doing with that endowment? Are you going to buy yourselves gold-plated canoes? What is perpetuity? Like, what are we saving money for? I'm not really sure. Sorry to get a little dark there.
Yeah, that is a dark but good response. So we're going to jump into audience questions here. We have this one from, I don't have names on these questions, so we're just going to be, you know, I hope whoever you are, you're excited to hear this question be answered. Starting with Professor Berman, how do orgs aimed at Jews in their 20s and 30s, such as Moishe House, One Table, and others, fit into the philanthropic industrial complex?
You know, I think that the whole idea of this complex is that it's, you know, it's created a kind of system where it's not really possible to sort of be in the space of, you know, Jewish communal life without having some kind of way in which this complex is sort of defining some of the structure and some of the rules, unless we can see it, right? Unless we start to see it, unless we start to ask questions about it. And you know, the truth of the matter is, and I'm sympathetic to this, like, you know, I don't want to just like be the intellectual sitting on the side, throwing the stones, right? Like, you know, there are all sorts of nonprofits that are doing good work that people care about and that, you know, are in their own right sort of important organizations, but that are still adhering to these kinds of rules, right? And are not feeling like they have any leverage to push back. And I think that, you know, a group like Jewish Liberation Fund or like IfNotNow or a bunch of the new kind of like what I see sort of as like since the kind of smartphone era, whatever, like these groups that are not defining themselves within the kind of structure of many of these mainstream Jewish philanthropic organizations. One thing that you guys are sort of buying for yourself is a potential for some leverage, even as you're giving up some of the rewards of sort of working within that system. And it's, you know, it's like anything else. Sometimes working within the system and sort of like incrementally making some change can work. And sometimes you sort of feel like there's not enough leverage when you're working within the system. And so, you know, I'm not interested in sort of like casting aspersion on any particular groups necessarily, but I'm more interested in sort of asking like, wherever you are in this system, right? Whether, you know, maybe you have a donor advised fund at New York's Jewish Communal Fund, or maybe your family foundation, you know, gives a lot of money to Birthright, or whatever it might be, like wherever you are, what are the questions that you can start to ask about why these are the rules that we seem to be playing by, and what we might be able to do that's different.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Professor Berman. And we're going to jump to a question for Anat next. Why haven't left-wing philanthropists learned from the successes of right-wing philanthropy as it relates to messaging and movement building? Like, what's getting in the way? I might have an answer in my head, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's a good question. I think, I mean, there are so many answers. We still have a pretty deep attachment, though it's better than it used to be, to a rational actor model of human behavior, and this notion that if we simply just tell people, the facty facts, then they will magically come to our side, because of course, reality has a left-wing bias. We are, in fact, on the correct side of things, and our beliefs are, in fact, toward making a healthier, more sustainable, more just world. And so we should just be able to explain that to people. We shouldn't need to message, because, you know, that's the provenance of kind of spin and all of this negative stuff that we don't want to attach ourselves to. And so there hasn't been as much of an interest or investment historically in, this has changed, but historically there hasn't been that much of an interest. There's been more of an interest in financing, rightly, understandably, you know, policy, like looking up policy prescriptions. Just take as a simple, just a super simple exercise, the difference in how left-wing economic policy organizations name themselves versus right-wing ones, right? So right-wing economic organizations are called things like Club for Growth, Americans for Prosperity. On our side, they're called Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, or for the Center for Economic and Policy Research, or Public Policy Institute, right? So they name for what they're trying to achieve, we name for the wonkiest, longest thing that we will have to turn into an acronym because it's unpronounceable. Because we think that we shouldn't have to sell our ideas. Our ideas are inherently superior. So that's part of it. But I also think that there is sort of this feeling of competition. There is this feeling of, it's hard for me to articulate because in many ways it is so deeply sad and ironic that we are the people who believe in interdependence and interconnection and collectivity and doing things together. But in many ways, what left social political movements is a very fractured set of organizations that exist at the local, state, and national level, whereas in the right, they just march much more in lockstep. And part of that is in keeping with their political ideology, that they are much more willing to sort of follow top-down orders and to hear, this is how we're giving, give it away. This is what we're messaging, message this. This is our policy position, adopt it.
I just love hearing about how effective right-wing philanthropists are. It brings joy to me every time I hear it. Last question is going to be one for both of you to answer. But how do we address the source of Jewish philanthropic funds, which, like all philanthropic funds, have been made through exploitation? And do you have a sense that things are changing somewhat in the philanthropic field to reckon specifically with this part of philanthropy's history?
I absolutely have. I wrote in the chat. I have the sense that things are changing, like in part because I have a sense that things are always changing. But also, what I said is that I think there's a growing language to talk about some of this, right? And to say, like, how can we be solving problems of injustice with a tool that itself is replicating forms of injustice? And, that's something that, like, Martin Luther King said, that's something that is not a new thing necessarily to say that, but I think that unfortunately some really high profile forms of malfeasance that also have been sort of tied into big philanthropic names, and I'm thinking of the Sacklers, but we could think of other families, have sort of like put this on the map more, that there's a way in which the system might actually not be helping to achieve the ends of justice. And, in the 50s and 60s, there's a great deal of congressional energy to regulate philanthropy in new ways. And that was coming out of, frankly, of McCarthyism and fear about power that wasn't operating openly. But that did create whatever kind of transparency and reporting that we have about philanthropy today, like the 990 tax form, was actually sort of created from that sense. And I think that the more that these conversations happen, and the more that there is language to identify why this system is not actually working, right? Why it's undermining democracy, why it's replicating some of the excesses of capitalism as opposed to sort of sloughing off those excesses. I think that there is more opportunity actually to think about change, to think about, for example, having the communities whose problems we think philanthropy might be solving actually be in charge of thinking about what to do with the funds, right? At least to have a seat at the table, if not to actually be themselves making the actual decisions. So maybe that's Pollyanna-ish, but I guess I don't really know how else to like move forward except to think that there is possibility. And I think the last thing I'll say, and here, Anat, I'm with you. I mean, I think that the fact that the world is really on fire, and all of these kinds of ideas about holding on to power in particular ways have been tied into this sense of like, the immortality of how we can live. And the more that we have to be questioning that, and we see that very presently in our world, I think that the more that these systems are not actually sustainable, and they're not psychologically comforting either.
Anat?
Well, I like to tell people that I'm a pathological optimist, which is the only way that I can continue to do my job, which to some degree is helping left-wing candidates win, which, is pretty thankless and there's lots of losing. So, I agree that I think there's change. I think a lot about Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who says those closest to the pain should be closest to the power, which is essentially, a permutation of what you just heard. People from whom resources, power, the ability to direct their own life and the freedom to just be able to make ends meet, let alone create a better future for generations to come. Those are the very people who should be in the seat of power. And it is a kind of not hidden secret. I think it's not hidden that the entire left-wing complex, whether that be, again, C3 advocacy or even political organizing in the direct kind of political space, we are constantly begging the master for money to buy tools to dismantle his house. And yes, I said his deliberately. That's the reality of it. But I think that the more people are aware of that, the more that we can stop kidding ourselves that just simply by, giving money occasionally, we've somehow assuaged our own guilt. I think thinking through the framework that philanthropy is about the redistribution of power and thinking about where power resides and why it resides there and where power has never resided, I think that can be the basis for making more and better decisions and for accelerating. I would like to see as a entry policy solution, it's not a solution, but a step forward, I'd like to see the 5% endowment challenged. And I think that Jewish philanthropy can be absolutely at the vanguard of that. I think that is absurd. And I think just on the basis of the notion of tithing, which is of course 10%, that 5% endowment it's illogical. There's no justification for it. You shouldn't be making money off of giving away money. It's gross.
Now, would you believe that I could think of a Jewish philanthropic organization who does believe that people closest to the power should be closest to the pain, and who doesn't hold all their assets in perpetuity? I don't know. It might be. I don't know if anyone can think of one, but I can think of one. Thank you, Mariah. But thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Berman. Thank you, Anat. I can tell you that as soon as we got this panel lined up, I was like running around my house, so excited to actually be able to moderate this session. Thanks so much to all of our friends at IfNotNow. Your partnership on this has been incredibly helpful, and I think just really it's so important, everyone here to really be supporting organizations who are doing the work, whether it's us, whether it's IfNotNow, of trying to challenge these power structures. It's Passover and we're not free until we're all free. So I hope we can all get back to the work of doing that. But happy Pesach to everyone. And please follow up with, read Professor Berman's book, listen to Anat's podcast. I wish we had another hour to do this because it's really been so amazing. But I think we're gonna log off here. So thank you so much, everyone. Oh, and our next part of the series is going to be, I believe, on May 23rd. We're going to talk about Jewish studies, Jewish data, and exactly how the left can go about reclaiming the stories that shape Jewish communal narratives. So thank you so much, everyone, and until next time.